Douglas. We do this every time you come in. We do an entire show off the air, and then we go on the air to start talking. Douglas Carswell, President and CEO of Mississippi Center for Public Policy. How are you today?
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me on.
It's always great to have you here. And at this point, I wish we'd have recorded it. We could just play back the conversation we had before we went on the air because there's a lot going on. But you guys have something that is an initiative. I want to start with that I think is really neat, a set of legislative goals that you've laid out.
We've got the Mississippi Freedom Agenda. This is a series of 12 reforms that we think our lawmakers could pass to improve and lift up our state. They're things that we don't need to look to Washington to do. We don't need to wait for federal handouts. These are things that our lawmakers could do this session. And what I'm really pleased about is all of these 12 reforms, which we published, we now see bills in the legislature to try and make each one of these 12 happen. It's very exciting.
Very nice. So run down a few of them, if you don't mind.
I mean, education is one of the key issues. We're never going to lift Mississippi up unless we tackle the issues of education. So one of our proposals is that we cap the amount of education funding that can be spent on administration costs by school boards. And I'm delighted to say there's legislation to do that. We think it's really important that mums and dads can move their child from one school to another and control their tax dollars when they do that. So we've got a bill on open enrollment to allow them to do that. We also think we need more charter schools. There are only 7 in the whole state, one of the lowest rates in the country. We would like to see more charter schools. So we've got a very exciting program on education reform. We think critical race theory is being taught. We published a report showing it's being taught. We think it's incredibly divisive ideology, very extremist ideology. So we've published 2 bills to tackle this. And I'm delighted that Michael McClendon's bill in the Senate now has 1 in 4, I think it is, senators sponsoring it. So I think there's a real chance that we can actually tackle this toxic ideology head on. But we're also big advocates for income tax abolition. If we want to give our state a boost, if we want to grow the way that Tennessee's growing, if we want to make sure the next generation of Mississippians don't have to move to Nashville or Dallas to earn a living, we need to abolish the state income tax. And I think there's a real chance of doing that. Red tape. One of the reasons why Mississippi hasn't grown, we are one of the most over-regulated states in the whole of America. And so I think we need a really comprehensive program of deregulation. We've got bills to try and do that in specific areas. And we're also very supportive of efforts by some of our elected officials to actually get rid of a lot of the good old boy red tape and regulation.
Well, I know my friend, Secretary of State Michael Watson, has a press conference coming up. Right?
He is. He's really taking the lead on this. There are things that he's doing that's really exciting. It's really exciting to be working with him, and I'm looking forward to hearing what he's got to say on that. But I think there are also things we can do in the legislature. Take, for example, healthcare. One of the reasons why people in Mississippi can't access affordable healthcare is because the healthcare market is rigged. It's rigged by something called the con laws. Appropriately, the Certificate of Need con laws are a con. They create a series of red tape regulations that prevent any new providers coming into the market. This is great if you're a current hospital. It means you've got a captive audience. It's not so great if you're on a low income and you can barely make those insurance payments. It's really bad news for ordinary Mississippians. By reforming and removing the con laws, we think you could get the kind of affordable health care that you find in Florida and Texas and Alabama and elsewhere. We've got one of the most rigged healthcare markets in the United States. Now's the opportunity for lawmakers who talk about wanting healthcare to be improved to actually do something about it. They might upset some vested interests, but the louder the parasitic vested interests squeal, the more important these reforms are.
And that's the thing, is that those other states that you talked about don't have that system in place. Yeah. It's the only thing I have ever heard of. We talk all the time about the importance of a free market. Yeah. It's the only thing I've ever seen where before you're allowed to open a business, your competitor has to say it's okay. Yeah. That's the opposite of a free market.
It's the opposite of a free market. It's the kind of thing you would have expected to have found in Soviet Eastern Europe. I mean, it is the antithesis of the American ideal. And it explains why people in Mississippi, not really poor people, people of quite good means in Mississippi, can't afford healthcare. And this has to change. Rather than hosing federal dollars at healthcare, we need to pass this legislation to reform the healthcare market so that people in Mississippi can access the kind of affordable healthcare that is available in other states.
And the problem with hosing federal money at it, as you so aptly put it, is that sooner or later that spigot is turned off.
Of course. And if you hose federal dollars at it, you just push the price up, don't you? You've got to increase the number of healthcare providers. I'll give you just one example. If you run a home health agency, you've got no shortage of clients in Mississippi, right? There are lots of baby boomers nearing the age where they need kind of home health care. You can't start a new home health care business unless you get a permit, and the permit is issued from your competitors. It is simply morally indefensible. This is the opportunity for our lawmakers to do something about it. So, I mean, healthcare reform, deregulation, but above all, education. If you want to see Mississippi improve, Mississippi for far too long has been 50th out of 50 states by so many measures. If we are going to change that, we need to give mums and dads control over their tax dollars. We need a system of open enrollment. And I think we could do that.
I think we should do it. I'm just interested to see when the dust settles if we can make it happen.
Well, inertia from politicians always comes with an excuse. They'll always try and find an excuse, but we've got to be patient about this. This isn't about what's suitable and convenient for the administrators. It's not what's suitable and convenient for the well-paid officials in the Mississippi Department of Education. This is about children. Why is it that the United States can put rockets on Mars, but we can't teach 14 and 15-year-old kids to read and write properly in West Jackson? Because if we ran NASA the way we run some of these school boards, we wouldn't even get liftoff. We need to fundamentally change the way we provide education. And the way to do that is to give mum and dad control of the tax dollars. They're the ultimate guarantor that we get the best system of education. It's widespread in other states. You go to Florida, you've got school choice. You've got Florida. Poor people in Florida, people on low incomes in Florida, have the opportunities that in Mississippi only rich people have. That has to change.
Well, and you put your finger right on the entire issue here, because when we talk about improving education, everyone gets caught up in the argument of, well, not every child is cut out to be a doctor or a physicist or anything. We're talking about the basics. We're talking about the reason that one of the first classes most kids, if they go to a community college or a college, is enrolled in is remedial English. That is a major change from just in my lifetime when you used to take, several foreign languages in high school. Mm-hmm. Now they're not even learning their language properly.
If you fail on the basics, if you don't know how to read and write properly, and if you don't understand basic math, what chance do you have in life? This isn't about whether you're going to be an astrophysicist or a brain surgeon. What chance do you have to be the best you can be if you go to a school where you're not even taught to read and write properly? Now, there have been numerous initiatives to try and address these problems, but all of these initiatives have, number one, very little to show for it. Number two, they're tackling the symptoms. The fundamental problem is that the tax dollars are automatically allocated by the system. We need to fund children and their outcomes rather than a system that puts children second.
See, you're getting into my wheelhouse now. I've been griping about, my wife is tired of hearing this at the house. I've been griping about this for a while. To me, the biggest fundamental problem we have in America right now and in the state is that we have lost sight of what the goal is supposed to be. We are so focused on the process that we quit focusing on the results that we're wanting to get. And as long as the process is okay, well, the results just don't matter. We have got to reverse that line of thinking back to what it was and focus on the results, on the end game, or we're never going to get anywhere.
I think it's even worse than that, Dave. We have a system where senior officials tell us that the education system pre-COVID was improving in Mississippi because they were looking at a set of dodgy statistics. If you look at the ACT scores, which can't be manipulated, there's no evidence of any improvement. In fact, there's evidence of a slight decrease in standards pre-COVID. Goodness knows what has happened since COVID. We need to recognize that the current system is not working. A system that denies mum and dad ultimate control over where their child goes to school is a system that is never going to give them the outcomes that we need.
Douglas Carswell in the studio with us. We'll continue with him on The Gallo Show on Supertalk Mississippi next. Go, Douglas Carswell in the studio with us. We were talking during the break. It doesn't matter what you propose. You're going to have somebody that's going to come out and say, that's a horrible idea. You can't do that. But sometimes what they don't realize is by arguing against some of these changes, they're admitting that they could do better.
Yeah, I mean, change is never easy because if it was easy, it would have happened, right? Take something like the Certificate of Need con laws, which restrict Mississippians access to healthcare. These have been on the books for 40 years. Every time you propose removing them, someone comes along and says, if you remove them, it's going to affect the bottom line on my hospital. Well, sure, it may have an impact, but doesn't that tell you that your hospital perhaps is operating with a rigged market? And actually what we need to do is ensure that maybe there's an additional hospital or maybe a multiplicity of healthcare providers. Similarly with education, if you advocate change, you get people expressing concern. Now, some of that concern is legitimate. I think sometimes people, they want the best for their kids. They want to make sure that their schools in their district continue to be well run. But I think some of those fears are sometimes misplaced. So what I think is really important is that when advocates for reform, people like myself who say, we can improve Mississippi by reforming healthcare and education, we need to be super sensitive to those concerns, and we need to explain to people with legitimate concerns, mums and dads and teachers, that actually some of their concerns, they're legitimate, but they're actually overstated. They're not the concerns that they might fear. But often in a legislature, I think particularly where you've got a very fractious political system where Democrats and Republicans don't tend to work together, one of the consequences of that
I hadn't noticed.
One of the consequences of that is it means that sometimes both parties don't perhaps think afresh and think anew. They retreat into their comfort zones. And what I really hope is that in this legislative session, we start to see some of these long overdue reforms. I mean, imagine what it would mean for Mississippi if we got rid of the income tax. We had this extraordinarily overwhelming vote in the House, 96 versus 12. I think Speaker Gunn and the governor, who've been long-term advocates for getting rid of income tax, can claim not only overwhelming support from Republicans, I think actually they've created a cross-party consensus. Now, wouldn't it be amazing for Mississippi if there was a cross-party consensus to get rid of the income tax and make our state as competitive as Florida or Tennessee? That's the kind of change that we so desperately need.
Well, and that was going to be my next question, and I think you just answered it, was in this legislative session, with everything that we see laid out on the table that they're going to be dealing with, what would you feel is the most important thing? If you had your magic wish from the genie in the lamp and you got one thing just to pass straight through, what would it be? Would it be the income tax removal?
I think income tax abolition, because that would mean instantly every Mississippi worker would get an instant pay rise. At the moment, every $20 you earn as a Mississippi worker, you have to give $1 to the state government. And they have $1 billion surplus, so they can afford to actually let you keep your money. And if you get to keep that extra dollar out of every $20 you earn, you can spend it on your family. You can spend it on your priorities. You can spend it better than politicians in Jackson. So I think that would be my number one wish. But I think a very close second would be giving mums and dads control over their tax dollars when it comes to education. We have in Mississippi some first-class school board districts, but we also have some failing ones. We've done a bit of research and we've worked out that over half of all students in failing districts are within 27 minutes drive of a school in an A-rated or B-rated district. So wouldn't it be amazing if we could give mums and dads control over their tax dollars? It would force some of those badly run school board districts to fundamentally change the way they manage their schools, to maybe pay their teachers better, maybe bring in some good teachers, maybe spend a little bit less money on their administration costs. It would force them to run their school board districts like the Madison counties, like the Rankin counties, like the DeSoto counties. The only way we're going to achieve that, though, is by giving people control, mums and dads control of their tax dollars.
Can it be that easy, though? If we give the parents the control, will it lead to those changes, or will it just lead to louder yelling?
I think it would lead to changes, and I think it would lead to some pretty significant changes really quite rapidly. And the reason I say that is because look at Florida. If you are in Orlando, Florida, you have, even if you're on very low income, you have the ability to choose the right school for your child. And because of that, it means, number one, children choose a school. So the relationship between the child and the school is one of wanting to be there. So there's an ethos of participation and involvement that sometimes there isn't when you're randomly allocated by the system a school. Secondly, it means that schools kind of have to compete. They have to try and make themselves attractive. And I think third and most important, it means that even people on low income in Florida have the same opportunities to get the best education for their child that today only well-off people in Mississippi have. The Florida example is just one. You look around other states, there are all sorts of examples. We can, by introducing this reform, make sure that Mississippi is no longer bottom of the class in education. Look, we've got the highest paid state superintendent in Mississippi of any state in America. It's not top-down initiatives that are going to change the education system. It's giving mums and dads control that's going to change things.
What do you think, swapping topics briefly here, what do you think about the referendum process?
I think it's disappointing that the rules were in such a muddle that they had a vote on medical marijuana, overwhelming support for reform, and then they went, whoops, we didn't do that properly, it's null and void. This is actually an opportunity, though, not just to get on and introduce what the voters voted for when it comes to medical marijuana. I think we need to have a right to trigger initiative votes. But I think the threshold should, number one, be lower, so that it should be easier to trigger an initiative. But I don't think an initiative should be a constitutional reform. You can't constantly try and impose your reform by getting it written, hardwired into the state constitution. Have a right of initiative that leads to legislative change, to changing the state law. Now, some people would say, hang on, that means that a future legislature could reverse that change. Yeah. Politics and lawmaking should be about fine-tuning, admitting errors, correcting errors, new circumstance, new knowledge. We shouldn't have a system of initiative that is solely geared to amending the state constitution. We should be looking to allow people a right to change the state laws, not just the state constitution.
When you say lower the barrier of entry to get a referendum process started, what, do you have a figure in mind? What would you want to lower it to?
I don't. I mean, there are other states that have initiative rights. Some say sort of, you've got to get sort of 10 to 15% of voters to sign a petition. California has a model that is really quite a high threshold, but we've seen that triggered. There are other states that, particularly in the Midwest, that have initiative rights. I don't have a magic figure, but I think the way the trigger process is written at the moment makes it incredibly difficult to trigger a vote. And when you do then have a vote, it means that any change results in a constitutional change. Why don't we lower the threshold so we get more frequent votes, but they're only changes to the state law, so that if, voters sometimes make mistakes, voters sometimes vote the wrong way. If we vote to amend the law, we can undo that if it works out not to be sensible. And I think this is particularly important for something like medical marijuana. I'm supportive of medical marijuana, but who knows what would happen if we look back in 10 or 15 years. We might look at the situation with medical marijuana and recognize that actually this liberalization was a mistake. Who knows? America's got a history of, for example, prohibition. Prohibition was introduced as a constitutional amendment. It turned out to be wrong, and I think most people now recognize it's wrong. Let's make initiative votes about constitutional reform. Let's make them easier, lower the threshold, but they should be about changing the state law, not the state constitution.
And prohibition, of course, was horrifically ineffective. I mean, I'm sorry. My son, he read a book, and he has told me this story about 5 times from the book already because it made an impact. There was a reporter from the New York Times during Prohibition decided to go around and see how long it would take him to find some alcohol, to find a drink at various places in the country. His record was 10 seconds in New Orleans. He got off the plane, got on the taxi, and said, "Where can I find a drink?" And the guy just pulled a bottle out from under the seat and said, "Here you go, man."
It had all sorts of perverse incentives. I mean, one of the consequences is once you made alcohol illegal, it became more logical for people who were brewing things to make smaller amounts of liquid but more potent and stronger. So you had less beer and more moonshine and whiskey and what have you, all sorts of absurd incentives. But my point, I think, is that Mississippi does need to have an initiative. You do, in this day and age, need to allow the voters to vote directly on key questions. But those shouldn't be constitutional amendments. They should be state laws.
C-Spire text line. I work in Louisiana. People find out I live in Mississippi, and they say, how can you afford to live there with all those taxes? That's your point exactly. Douglas Carswell, the president and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. Always enjoy having you in here, sir.
It's always one of the highlights of my week to be here, so thank you so much.
Hopefully, talk to you again soon.